No one would stand up to give the eulogy at my cruel grandmother's funeral. Every eye in the funeral home avoided each other. But I, a granddaughter she'd seemingly forgotten, rose and crafted a beautiful lie, only for her lawyer to approach afterward, smiling. "Congratulations, you just passed her final test." Why would a woman who'd been heartless her entire life leave me an inheritance no one expected? And why did that silent funeral become the beginning of a revenge that would bring the entire family to their knees? My name is Claire Holloway, and I've never seen a funeral this empty of grief. The Morrison and Sons Funeral Home sat on the corner of Oak Street, its dark oak walls and heavy scent of white lilies unchanged from every other service I'd attended here. But today, the atmosphere was different. No tears, no whispered condolences, just the oppressive silence of 30-odd people scattered throughout the room, each in their own corner, deliberately avoiding eye contact as if a glance might spread some contagious disease. My grandmother, Agnes Holloway, lay in a polished oak casket worth $20,000. Her face had been carefully made up, her perpetually pursed lips finally coaxed into a gentle smile, probably the only smile the mortician could create from a face that had spent 82 years perfecting the art of scowling and sneering. I sat in the third row, wedged between two empty seats. To my left was Aunt Martha's spot. She'd suddenly had to travel for business the moment she heard grandmother had passed. To my right should have been my cousin David, but he'd chosen to sit in the very last row, probably for easier access to the exit once this ordeal ended. "Ladies and gentlemen," the trembling voice of old Mr. Morrison, the funeral director, echoed through the silent space. "Let us begin with, sharing memories of Agnes Holloway's life." He looked around the room hopefully, like a kindergarten teacher waiting for a volunteer to raise their hand, but no one moved. Uncle Robert stared intently at his phone. Cousin Sarah pretended to dab at non-existent tears. And Thomas, the youngest cousin who'd once been grandmother's favorite, studied an imaginary stain on his tie with forensic intensity. A minute passed, then two. The wall clock's ticking sounded like a drumbeat of urgency. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat for the third time, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "Perhaps the family needs more time to—" "No need," Uncle Robert's gravelly voice cut him off. "Just proceed to the next part." But what was the next part when no one would speak a word about the deceased? When Agnes Holloway's entire 82 years weren't enough to compel anyone in this room to stand and say even one kind thing? I looked around at the familiar faces from my childhood, now older, wearier, and all wearing poorly concealed expressions of relief. She was gone, the woman with iron hands, with scrutinizing eyes that could spot every weakness, with words sharp as razor blades finally silent in that wooden box. And not one of us felt genuinely sad. The funeral home's air conditioning hummed softly, the only sound competing with that relentless clock. The afternoon sun filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across the flowers that surrounded the casket. White roses, white lilies, white carnations, everything white, as if someone thought enough white flowers could purify the memory of Agnes Holloway. But we all knew better. We knew about the family dinners that felt like boardroom interrogations, the birthday cards that came with written assessments of our failures, the Christmas gatherings where she'd rank her grandchildren by their earning potential, out loud, while we opened presents. "Miss Claire." I startled at the sound of my name. Linda, grandmother's elderly housekeeper, was looking at me from the front row. She was the only one who seemed genuinely grieved, probably because she was the only one who'd been paid to endure Agnes Holloway. "Would you like to say something, dear?" Linda's voice was pleading. I shook my head reflexively. What could I say? That my grandmother was the cruelest woman I'd ever known, that she'd turned every family dinner into a cold war, that she enjoyed watching her children and grandchildren fight over scraps from her table like starving dogs. But then I saw the casket again, saw those white flowers, perhaps the only beautiful thing in this room, and I thought about someone living 82 years on this earth, accumulating $4.5 million, raising 3 children and 8 grandchildren, only to die without a single person willing to stand and say goodbye. That wasn't death. That was complete obliteration. And somehow, that made me stand up. I'll speak. The room seemed to wake from a trance. 30 heads turned toward me simultaneously, eyes wide with shock. Claire Holloway, the nobody granddaughter, the one grandmother never noticed, the one whose name never came up in family meetings about inheritance, was the only one willing to give a eulogy. Uncle Robert's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his receding hairline. Aunt Patricia's mouth fell open, revealing thousands of dollars of dental work. Even Thomas looked up from his tie, genuine surprise breaking through his studied indifference. As I walked to the podium, I caught fragments of whispers. What's she playing at? Since when does Agnes even know her name? This should be interesting, said I. My hands trembled as I gripped the edges of the podium. The microphone loomed before me like a snake ready to strike. I had no prepared speech, no notes, no idea what words would come out of my mouth. I only knew that someone had to say something, because even Agnes Holloway, for all her faults, deserved words at her funeral, even if they were lies. I looked out at the assembled family, my family, though we'd never felt like one. Their faces ranged from suspicious to amused to outright hostile. They were waiting for me to embarrass myself, to prove once again that I was the granddaughter who didn't matter, the one who worked a mediocre job at a mid-tier accounting firm while they pursued their law degrees and medical practices and hedge fund careers. They had no idea what was coming, neither did I. The funeral home fell silent again, but this time it was an expectant silence, the kind that comes before a storm. I took a deep breath, tasting the sticky sweetness of funeral flowers, and began to speak. Before I tell you what I said at that podium, you need to understand who I was in the Holloway family hierarchy, or rather, who I wasn't. I was 27 years old, working as an auditor at Brennan & Associates, a respectable but unremarkable accounting firm downtown, while my cousins flaunted their Ivy League degrees and 6-figure starting salaries. I'd graduated from the state university with decent grades and student loans that would take another decade to pay off. In the Holloway family, that made me practically invisible. My mother, Agnes's middle daughter, had died when I was 15. Cancer, quick and brutal. My father, a quiet man who'd never quite fit into the Holloway dynasty, remarried 2 years later and moved to Oregon with his new wife. I stayed behind to finish high school, living with friends, working part-time jobs, and showing up to family gatherings only when absolutely necessary. Agnes had made it clear where I stood from the beginning. At my high school graduation, while she'd given my cousin David a Rolex for getting into Harvard, she'd handed me a $50 bill and a pamphlet about community college. For those of us with more modest ambitions, she'd said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I learned early not to want anything from her, not her money, not her approval, not even her attention. While my cousins performed elaborate dances for her favored David with his law degree, Sarah with her medical residency, Thomas with his Wall Street connections, I simply existed. I showed up to mandatory family dinners, sat quietly through her critiques of my appearance, my job, my lack of vision, and then I went home. That one, I once overheard her tell Aunt Martha, is just like her father, no backbone, no drive. She'll be counting other people's money her whole life instead of making her own. The thing is, she wasn't entirely wrong. I did lack the cutthroat ambition that ran in Holloway blood. I didn't want to crush competitors or build empires. I wanted a quiet life with meaningful work, good friends, maybe a family someday. In Agnes Holloway's world, that made me a failure. But it also made me something else unthreatening. While my cousins schemed and maneuvered for position in her will, I became furniture, background noise, the granddaughter who would show up, endure whatever needed enduring, and leave without asking for anything. I'd visit her once a month, not because anyone expected me to, but because it felt like the right thing to do. She lived alone in that massive colonial house Linda came during the days, but the nights were all Agnes and her ghosts. I'd bring Chinese takeout. She complained about the sodium, but ate it anyway, and listened to her complain about everything from the neighbor's dog to the Democrats to the way her own children were waiting for her to die. "You're all vultures," she'd say, pointing a bony finger at me as if I were personally responsible for the family's greed. "Circling, waiting for me to drop so you can pick my bones clean." I never argued, never pointed out that I wasn't circling anything. I just sat there, eating my lo mein, occasionally making neutral sounds of acknowledgement. Sometimes she'd forget I was there entirely, ranting at the empty air about betrayals real and imagined. Other times she'd fix those sharp gray eyes on me and say, "What are you looking at? Calculating how much you'll inherit? I'll tell you now, nothing. You'll get nothing from me." "That's fine, grandmother." I'd always reply, and I meant it. The truth was, those visits weren't about her or any potential inheritance. They were about my mother. Mom would have wanted someone to check on her, no matter how awful she was. So I did, month after month, year after year, expecting nothing and receiving exactly that. My cousins thought I was an idiot. "Why waste your time?" Sarah asked once at Thanksgiving. "She doesn't even remember your name half the time." But she did remember. Agnes Holloway forgot nothing. She remembered every slight, every disappointment, every perceived betrayal. And apparently, she remembered every visit from her nobody granddaughter who never asked for anything. I didn't know that then. Standing at that podium, all I knew was that I was the only one willing to speak at her funeral, and that said something deeply sad about the life she'd lived, about all our lives, really. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably my boyfriend, Jake, wondering if I was okay. He'd offered to come with me, but I'd told him no. The Holloway family drama was something you had to be born into to understand. Jake came from normal people who hugged at reunions and meant it when they said, "I love you." He wouldn't understand a funeral where the primary emotion was relief. I looked out at my family one more time. Uncle Robert was now scrolling through emails, not even pretending to pay attention. Aunt Patricia whispered something to her daughter that made them both smirk. Only Linda watched me with genuine interest, perhaps hoping someone would finally say something kind about the woman she'd served for 20 years. That's when I decided I wasn't going to tell the truth about Agnes Holloway. The truth was sitting in every crossed arm and averted gaze in that room. The truth was in the empty spaces where tears should have been. Instead, I was going to lie. I was going to create a grandmother worth mourning, if only for the length of a eulogy. Not for Agnes, she was beyond caring. Not for the family, they'd see through it immediately. But for the idea that everyone deserves to be mourned by someone, even if that someone has to make it all up. I thought of my mother then, how she'd always found something good to say about everyone, even her impossible mother. "She's tough because she had to be," Mom would say. The world wasn't kind to women like her. Maybe that's what I'd channel, my mother's generous spirit, speaking through me one last time, a gift to a woman who'd never wanted it, at a funeral that nobody wanted to attend. The microphone waited. The family waited. Agnes waited in her expensive box. And I began to speak. "My grandmother," I began, my voice surprisingly steady, "taught me that love doesn't always look like greeting cards and hugs." A few heads lifted. Uncle Robert's thumb paused over his phone screen. I saw Aunt Patricia's smirk falter slightly. They were expecting venom, perhaps, or maybe just awkward, stammering honesty. They weren't expecting this. "When I was 16, I continued, the lie flowing as smoothly as if it were memory. Just after my mother died, I showed up at grandmother's house one night. I had nowhere else to go. My father was dealing with his grief in his own way, and there I was, standing on her doorstep at midnight, with a backpack and red eyes." I paused, letting the image sink in. Linda dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even she didn't know this story, because it had never happened. She opened the door in her silk bathrobe, looking exactly as put together as she did at noon. She took one look at me and said, "Well, don't just stand there letting the heat out. Come in." That was it. No questions, no sympathy, no grand gestures, just, "Come in." The room had gone completely still. Even the clock seemed to tick more softly. "She made me hot chocolate," I said, warming to my fiction. Not from a packet from real chocolate melted on the stove with milk and a pinch of cinnamon. We sat at her kitchen table, and she didn't say a word about my mother. Instead, she told me about the time she'd run away from home at 17, how she'd made it all the way to Chicago before realizing she had nowhere to go but back. Thomas leaned forward slightly in his seat. This was hitting something in him, I could see it. The golden boy who'd never quite lived up to her impossible expectations. "Running away is easy," she told me that night. "It's the staying that takes courage, the building something from nothing, the refusing to let the world break you." And then she set up the guest room for me. Fresh sheets, extra blankets, a glass of water on the nightstand. She never asked how long I'd stay. She just let me stay. I glanced at the casket, at the woman who had never done any of these things, and felt an odd sensation. Not guilt, exactly. More like I was giving her a gift she'd never wanted but maybe had needed. "That's who Agnes Holloway was," I continued, looking directly at Uncle Robert now. "Not warm, not gentle, but present when it mattered. How many of us can say the same?" Robert's face flushed. He'd been in Europe when his father, Agnes's husband, had died. "Business," he'd said. "Unmissable opportunity." "She taught me about strength through example," I said. "When grandfather died, she stood at his graveside in a black dress and perfect pearls, dry-eyed and dignified. People whispered that she was cold, unfeeling, but I saw her that night, sitting alone in his study, touching the spines of his books one by one. Crying is a luxury," she told me when I found her there. "And I've never been able to afford luxuries." Another lie, but it felt true somehow. It felt like something the Agnes Holloway I was creating would have said. She never said, "I love you," not once in all the years I knew her, but she showed up, every school play, every graduation, every milestone. There she was, in the third row, wearing Chanel and checking her watch, but present. And when I'd look out at the audience, past all the beaming parents with their cameras and flowers, I'd see her there, my grandmother, the woman who didn't believe in applause but showed up anyway. Sarah was crying now, real tears, not the performative dabs from earlier. I wondered what memory I'd touched, what moment of longing for a grandmother who might have been. She wasn't easy to love, I admitted, and saw several heads nod involuntarily. She demanded excellence and accepted nothing less. She could find fault in a sunset. Her criticism was sharp enough to draw blood, but I paused, searching for the right words to complete this portrait of a woman who had never existed. But she was ours, our North Star. Even when we were sailing away from her, our standard. Even when we failed to meet it, she was the woman who built this family from nothing, who took a small town nobody's name and turned it into something that mattered. And if she was hard, maybe it's because she had to be. Maybe it's because the world she grew up in didn't allow women to be soft and successful both. I thought of my mother then, really thought of her, and felt tears prick my eyes. These, at least, were real. My mother used to say that grandmother loved us the only way she knew how, through expectations, through pushing us to be better than we thought we could be. And maybe that's not the kind of love we wanted, but it was the kind she had to give. The lie was becoming something else now. Not truth, exactly, but a kind of wish, a eulogy for the grandmother we'd all secretly hoped she might become, someday, if we just waited long enough or proved ourselves worthy enough. "I visited her last month," I said, this part actually true. "She was sitting in her garden, watching the roses she'd planted 40 years ago. They're dying," she told me, "but they're still beautiful." I asked if she wanted me to call someone, a gardener maybe, to try to save them. She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Let them die. They've earned it." I looked around the room, meeting eyes that had avoided mine for years. I think maybe that's what she'd want us to say about her. That she lived on her own terms, that she bloomed despite the thorns, that she earned her rest. My voice caught on the last words, surprising me. Somewhere in the telling, the fiction had become a kind of truth, not about Agnes Holloway as she was, but about the space she'd left behind, the grandmother-shaped hole in all of our lives that we'd now have to fill with something else. Agnes Holloway was not a warm woman, I concluded. She was not a gentlewoman, but she was a woman who stayed, who built, who refused to let the world break her. And in the end, isn't that its own kind of love? I stepped back from the podium, my legs shaky. The room remained silent for a long moment, processing what they'd just heard. Then Linda began to clap, soft and alone at first, before others slowly joined in. Not everyone Uncle Robert's hand stayed firmly in his lap, but enough to make it feel like a real funeral, with real grief, for a real person who had been really loved. As I walked back to my seat, I caught sight of something that made my breath catch. A man in an expensive suit sitting in the very last row, someone I didn't recognize. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He nodded once, as if in approval, then made a small note in a leather-bound notebook. I sat down, my heart still racing, and tried to process what I'd just done. I'd given Agnes Holloway the eulogy she'd never earned but somehow deserved anyway. I'd painted over a lifetime of cruelty with pretty words and prettier lies. And somehow, it felt like exactly what she would have wanted. The lies I told that day transformed the funeral completely. What had started as an obligatory gathering became something almost resembling genuine mourning. I watched, fascinated and slightly horrified, as my fictional Agnes Holloway took root in the minds of those present. During the viewing that followed my eulogy, people actually approached the casket. Sarah stood there for a full minute, her medical school posture wavering as she whispered something to the corpse. David cleared his throat roughly and muttered what might have been, "Goodbye, grandmother." Even Thomas, who'd spent years as her designated favorite only to fall from grace when he chose art school over business, touched the edge of the casket briefly. The reception was held in the funeral home's adjoining room, finger sandwiches and weak coffee, the universal refreshments of grief. I stationed myself near the door, planning a quick escape, but person after person stopped me. "That was beautiful, Claire," Aunt Patricia said, squeezing my hand, her rings dug into my fingers. "I never knew about that night when you were 16. Agnes never mentioned." "She wouldn't have," I said, which was true enough. Patricia's eyes misted. "No, she wouldn't. God, she was so private, so proud. I remember when my marriage was falling apart. She just showed up one day with movers, didn't say a word, just had them pack my things. When Richard came home drunk and angry, she stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and said, 'Try it, just that, try it.' He backed down like a scolded puppy." This, I realized with a start, was actually true. I'd heard whispers about Aunt Patricia's first marriage, the one nobody talked about bruises hidden under summer scarves, about how she'd gone to live with Agnes for 6 months before the divorce was finalized. "She never mentioned it again," Patricia continued. "Never held it over me, just gave me shelter when I needed it. Your eulogy reminded me that underneath all that hardness, she did care. In her own way." As Patricia moved away, I caught sight of the stranger again, the man with the expensive suit and leather notebook. He was talking to Linda by the coffee urn, nodding seriously at whatever she was saying. When he glanced up and caught me looking, he smiled that same enigmatic smile. "Claire," Uncle Robert's voice made me turn. He stood there awkwardly, hands in his pockets like a chastened schoolboy. "Listen, what you said up there." He trailed off, looking everywhere but at me. "Robert Holloway, senior partner at Holloway, Krensky and Associates," at a loss for words. "She called me," he said finally, "when Dad was dying, called me in London and said he was asking for me. I told her I'd catch the next flight after my meeting. The meeting ran long, and then there was another one, and—" he shrugged helplessly. "By the time I got there, he was gone. She never said a word about it, never threw it in my face, not once in 15 years. That's not nothing." "No," I agreed quietly, "that's not nothing." He nodded jerkily and walked away, leaving me to wonder at this strange alchemy I'd performed. My lies had somehow transmuted into truth, not about who Agnes had been, but about the complicated ways she'd inhabited all our lives, the spaces where cruelty and care intersected, the moments when even the hardest people showed glimpses of humanity. Lovely eulogy. I spun around. The stranger stood behind me, extending a business card between manicured fingers. Richard Devereaux, he said, Mrs. Holloway's attorney. I took the card automatically. Expensive stock with embossed lettering. I didn't know grandmother had changed lawyers. She'd been with Brennan and Associates for decades. She retained me for some specialized matters, Devereaux said smoothly. I wonder if I might have a word with you privately. There's a small conference room just down the hall. Now, I gestured at the reception still in progress. I should really... It will only take a moment. His smile never wavered, but something in his eyes suggested this wasn't really a request. And I think you'll find it worth your time. I followed him down a carpeted hallway, lined with soothing watercolors of beaches and forests, the aesthetic of institutionalized comfort. The conference room was small and stuffy, with a round table and chairs that had seen better decades. Devereaux closed the door and gestured for me to sit. He took the chair across from me, setting his notebook on the table with precise movements. Tell me, Miss Holloway, he began, do you know why you gave that eulogy? I'm sorry. It's a simple question. Why did you stand up when no one else would? I shifted uncomfortably. Someone had to, it seemed wrong, to let her be buried in silence. Even though she was, by all accounts, a difficult woman. Even though your relationship with her was distant at best. How do you... I've been Mrs. Holloway's attorney for the past 3 years, he interrupted smoothly. She was remarkably thorough in her assessments of family members. She described you as, and I quote, the only one who doesn't want anything from me, which makes her either very stupid or very smart. I laughed despite myself. That sounds like her. Indeed, he opened his notebook, scanning handwritten notes. You visited her monthly, never asked for money, never complained about being overlooked in family matters, never tried to ingratiate yourself. Why? I don't know, I said honestly. It just seemed like the right thing to do. She was old and alone. My mother would have wanted someone to check on her. Your mother? Something shifted in his expression. Catherine Holloway died of pancreatic cancer 12 years ago. Agnes's middle daughter. Yes. The one she was hardest on, he continued. The one who disappointed her by marrying beneath her station, by lacking ambition, by dying young. Heat rose in my face. My mother was worth 10 of... I'm not disparaging your mother, Miss Holloway. I'm quoting your grandmother. He leaned back in his chair. Do you know what else she said about Catherine? I shook my head, not trusting my voice. She said, Katie was the only one who never learned to be cruel. I failed her in that. The world eats the gentle alive, and I let her go into it defenseless. The words hit me like a physical blow. I thought of my mother, eternally optimistic, always seeing the best in everyone, crushed again and again by life's casual brutalities until cancer finished the job. Your eulogy, Devereaux continued, was an act of kindness toward a woman who had shown you very little. You created a fiction that allowed her to be mourned with dignity. You gave her family permission to remember her with something other than bitterness. He smiled that enigmatic smile again. It was exactly what she hoped you would do. I don't understand. Agnes Holloway was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. She knew exactly how she'd be remembered. She also knew that of all her descendants, you were the only one who might choose mercy over truth. He pulled out a sealed envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table between us. She left instructions that this was to be given to you only if you spoke at her funeral, only if you, in her words, proved you inherited something from Katie after all. I stared at the envelope. My name was written on it in Agnes's precise handwriting. What is it? I believe you'll find it's an invitation, Devereaux said, standing. The formal reading of the will is scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m. at my offices. The address is on the card I gave you. This, he tapped the envelope, is for you to read tonight, privately. He moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Miss Holloway. That was a magnificent eulogy. Complete fiction, of course, but magnificent nonetheless." He smiled wider. "Your grandmother would have been proud. She always did appreciate a well-constructed lie." With that, he was gone, leaving me alone with the envelope and the growing certainty that I'd just passed some kind of test I didn't know I was taking. I picked up the envelope, feeling its weight heavier than paper should be. Something else was inside, something that would explain why Agnes Holloway's attorney had sat through her funeral taking notes on my performance. But I didn't open it. Not yet. First, I had to get through the rest of this reception, accepting condolences for the loss of a grandmother who had never existed while the real one lay in her expensive box, probably laughing at us all from wherever cruel old women go when they die. As I stood to leave, I realized something the eulogy I'd given wasn't really a lie. It was a translation. I'd taken the language of Agnes Holloway cold, calculating, transactional, and translated it into something we could all understand, something we could mourn. Maybe that's what she'd wanted all along. Someone who could speak both languages. Someone who could make her human, even if only in death. I slipped the envelope into my pocket and went back to the reception, where my fictional grandmother was slowly becoming more real than the woman we were burying. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, staring at the envelope Devereaux had given me. Jake had offered to come over, but I told him I needed to be alone. The funeral had drained me in ways I couldn't explain, and somehow I knew whatever was in this envelope would require my full attention. My apartment was everything Agnes Holloway's house wasn't: small, cozy, filled with secondhand furniture and plants I occasionally remembered to water. The walls were covered with photos of friends, trips, moments of joy, no oil paintings of stern ancestors, no crystal chandeliers that required special cleaning, just life, lived comfortably within my means. I poured myself a glass of wine, the good stuff, a $12 bottle I'd been saving, and finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of Agnes's personal stationery and a brass key. "Claire, if you're reading this, then you've done what I expected, shown mercy to someone who showed you none. Your mother would be proud. I suppose I am too. Though pride was never my strong suit when it came to you. The key opens a safety deposit box at First National, Branch 447 Box, 1892. What you find there will explain everything, including why I've been testing you all these years. Yes, testing, every ignored birthday, every cruel comment, every time I pretended to forget your name, all calculated. You needed to prove you could show kindness without expectation of reward, that you could choose compassion over bitterness, that Katie's softness hadn't died with her. You passed. Tomorrow, when Devereaux reads my will, your family will implode. They've spent decades dancing for my money, never realizing I was watching for something else entirely. You, who never danced at all, are about to learn why. One piece of advice when the wolves turn on you, and they will remember that I kept extensive records, financial records, personal records, the kind of records that reveal exactly who people are when they think no one is watching. The key to those records is in the safety deposit box as well. Your family believes I was cruel for sport. They're wrong. I was cruel with purpose. I was building you an armor of indifference, teaching you to survive without their approval. You'll need it for what comes next. Don't forgive them too quickly. Claire, your mother's greatest weakness was her inability to hold a grudge. It killed her as surely as the cancer, all that stress of trying to make peace, to hold the family together, to forgive slights that should have been met with fury. Be better than Katie. Be better than me. Be both kind and strong. The combination to the safety deposit box is your mother's birthday. Of course it is. A. P. The hot chocolate story was particularly inspired. I should have done that. That night you showed up. I saw you from my bedroom window, standing on the porch for 20 minutes before you knocked. I almost went down. Almost. But I needed you to be stronger than sentiment. I see now that sentiment can be its own kind of strength. I read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of manipulation and, strangely, affection. Agnes Holloway had been playing a game none of us knew about, with rules only she understood, and somehow, by refusing to play at all, I'd won. The next morning, I went to First National before work. The safety deposit box was in the old part of the bank, all marble and brass and the kind of gravitas modern branches lack. The clerk, a woman about my mother's age would have been, led me to the private viewing room without questions. Inside the box were 3 things: a thick manila folder labeled Family Accounts, a leather journal, and another envelope with my name on it. I opened the folder first and immediately understood why Agnes had called them wolves. The records went back 20 years, every loan from the family trust, every emergency that required grandmother's help, every creative interpretation of shared assets. David had been skimming from the estate management fees. Sarah had falsified expenses for grandmother's medical care, billing for premium services while arranging basic ones. Thomas had sold family heirlooms on the sly, replacing them with forgeries. And Uncle Robert had been the worst of all. Power of attorney gave him access to Agnes's investment accounts, and he'd been using them as his personal trading playground, covering losses with elaborate shuffles that would have made Bernie Madoff proud. They'd been stealing from her for years, all of them, everyone except my parents, who'd never had access to anything worth stealing. The journal was Agnes's personal account of every family betrayal, written in her precise script. Not just the thefts, those were almost footnotes. The real records were of cruelty, the time David had laughed about putting her in a home when she got too difficult, Sarah's recorded conversations about having Agnes declared incompetent, the family meetings where they'd discussed my mother's medical bills as an unnecessary drain on resources. One entry stood out, dated just after my mother's death. They came like vultures before Katie's body was cold. Robert wanted to know about her life insurance. Was it part of the estate? Sarah suggested selling Catherine's jewelry, since Claire won't appreciate its value anyway. Only Claire came to the funeral just to mourn. She spoke about her mother with such love, such loss. No mention of money, no calculations, just grief, pure and clean. I found my heir. The rest can rot. The second envelope contained a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of Agnes's will, with key sections highlighted: the family home, the investments, the offshore accounts I hadn't even known existed. Everything went to me. Everything except token amounts to keep the will from being easily contested. $4.7 million. Properties in 3 states. Art and jewelry worth another $1 million at least. And at the bottom, in Agnes's handwriting, use it wisely. Or better yet, use it viciously. They certainly would have. I sat in that small room, surrounded by marble and mahogany and the weight of unearned fortune, and laughed, actually laughed, until the sound bounced off the walls and came back to me like an echo of Agnes's own harsh cackle. She'd played us all. The grandmother who supposedly cared only about money had seen through everyone who grabbed for it. She'd watched her children and grandchildren reveal their true selves, year after year, while pretending to be too cruel to care. And she'd chosen me not because I was good or noble or deserving, but because I was the only one who'd treated her like a human being instead of an ATM with a pulse. I put everything back in the box except the copy of the will. That I folded carefully and put in my purse. In 6 hours, I'd sit in Richard Devereaux's office and watch my family discover they'd spent decades groveling for nothing. They'd turn on me immediately, of course, the nobody granddaughter who'd somehow stolen their birthright. But I had their secrets now. Every embezzlement, every cruelty, every petty betrayal documented in Agnes's careful hand. I had weapons I'd never wanted and armor I'd never asked for. As I left the bank, I thought about the eulogy I'd given, about the fictional grandmother who loved through expectations and expressed care through presence rather than words. I'd created her out of wishful thinking and mercy. But maybe I hadn't been entirely wrong. Agnes had been there, watching, recording, judging. She'd cared enough to test me, to prepare me, to arm me for the battle she knew would come. She'd just done it in the most Agnes Holloway way possible through manipulation, documentation, and the strategic distribution of pain. That afternoon, sitting in my cubicle at Brennan and Associates, I got a text from Sarah. Family meeting at Devereaux's at 2. Wear something nice. We're finally going to get what we deserve. I smiled, thinking of the papers in my purse, the key in my pocket, the knowledge in my head. Yes, I typed back, we certainly are. The test was over. The real game was about to begin. The law offices of Devereaux and Associates occupied the top floor of a gleaming downtown high-rise, all glass and chrome and understated wealth. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing my best suit, the one I'd bought for job interviews 3 years ago. It was navy blue, professionally tailored, and cost less than the shoes most of my relatives were wearing. The receptionist, a young man with perfect teeth and an even more perfect smile, led me to a conference room that could have comfortably hosted a small wedding. The table was a single piece of polished mahogany, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than my car. I was the first to arrive, which didn't surprise me. Punctuality wasn't a Holloway virtue unless money was directly involved. I chose a seat in the middle of the table, not at the head where Agnes would have sat, not at the foot where the least important family member would be relegated, but exactly in the center, neutral territory. Devereaux entered 5 minutes later, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the same enigmatic smile from yesterday. Miss Holloway, early, I see. I learned from the best, I said. Grandmother always said punctuality was the courtesy of kings. Did she now? His smile widened. How interesting, considering she was routinely 20 minutes late to everything except financial meetings. Before I could respond, the door burst open and the wolves arrived. Robert came first, phone pressed to his ear, still conducting business until the last possible second. Patricia followed, designer handbag clutched like a weapon, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists. Sarah swept in wearing surgical scrubs under a cashmere coat she'd come straight from the hospital, wanting everyone to know how important and busy she was. David brought up the rear in his $1,000 suit, hair perfectly styled, looking every inch the successful lawyer he wanted everyone to believe he was. Thomas slouched in last, ripped jeans and a vintage band t-shirt, his rebellion against the family dress code. The artist, too creative for conventional success, too pure for grandmother's money, or so he liked to project. They all stopped short when they saw me. Claire! Sarah's voice dripped disbelief. What are you doing here? Same as you, I assume, I said mildly. Mr. Devereaux asked me to come. But you're not. David caught himself. But we all knew what he'd been about to say. You're not important. You're not really family. You're not one of us. Please, everyone, take your seats, Devereaux interrupted smoothly. We have quite a bit to cover. The scramble for position was subtle but vicious. Robert claimed the head of the table as his right as eldest son. Patricia sat at his right hand, the power position. David and Sarah flanked them like lieutenants. Thomas threw himself into a chair at the far end, making a show of not caring while clearly caring desperately. They all avoided sitting near me, as if poverty might be contagious. Devereaux remained standing, opening his portfolio with theatrical precision. Before we begin, I must inform you that Mrs. Holloway insisted her will be read in its entirety, with all beneficiaries present. Any attempt to leave before the completion of the reading will result in automatic forfeiture of any inheritance. Typical, Robert muttered, controlling to the end. Furthermore, Devereaux continued, Mrs. Holloway requested that this be recorded for legal purposes. He gestured to a small camera in the corner I hadn't noticed. The recording will be sealed unless the will is contested, in which case it becomes evidence. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. David's jaw tightened. They were already calculating, already planning their challenges. Let's begin with the small bequests, Devereaux said, pulling out a document dense with legal text. To Linda Morrison, my housekeeper of 20 years, I leave the sum of $100,000 and my sincere gratitude for being the only person who could tolerate me daily. A nice gesture, more than any of them expected for the help. To various charities listed in Appendix A, I leave a combined sum of $500,000 to be distributed according to the attached schedule. Patricia sniffed. $500,000 to charity when her own family. Please hold all comments until the end, Devereaux said firmly. To my son, Robert Holloway, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my father's watch, which he has admired so vocally over the years. May he finally learn to tell time accurately, particularly when it comes to family obligations. Robert's face flushed deep red. $50,000 was nothing. Insulting. The watch was worth maybe $5,000 at most. To my daughter, Patricia Holloway Krensky, I leave $50,000 in my collection of self-help books. May she finally find the inner peace that has eluded her through 3 marriages and countless affairs. Patricia gasped. David smirked despite himself. To my grandson, David Holloway, I leave $50,000 in my complete set of law books, including Ethics in Practice. I suggest he start with that one. David's smirk vanished. To my granddaughter, Dr. Sarah Holloway, I leave $50,000 in my medical alert bracelet, a reminder that not all conditions can be billed to insurance. Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. To my grandson, Thomas Holloway, I leave $50,000 and my art collection specifically, the forgeries he created to replace the originals he sold. I always knew, dear boy, the real ones are in storage. Thomas went pale. The room was electric with rage and humiliation. Each bequest was calculated to wound, to expose, to punish. But the numbers $50,000, each from a fortune worth millions, that was the real insult. Which brings us to the primary estate, Devereaux said, turning the page with deliberate slowness. The remainder of my assets, including all properties, investments, accounts both domestic and international, and personal effects not otherwise designated, I leave to my granddaughter, Claire Elizabeth Holloway. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the room exploded. What? Robert slammed his hand on the table. That's impossible. This is insane. Sarah stood, chair screeching. She barely knew Claire. We can contest this, David said rapidly. Undue influence, mental incompetence. She was completely senile, Patricia shrieked. Claire must have manipulated her. Only Thomas remained silent, staring at me with something like awe. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, expression neutral. I'd practiced this moment in the mirror this morning, determined to show nothing they could use against me. Devereaux raised his hand for silence. There's more. Mrs. Holloway anticipated your reaction and asked me to read the following statement. To my loving family, who spent decades kissing my ass while stealing from my purse. Surprise, I knew about all of it, every skimmed fee, every falsified expense, every piece of silver you thought I wouldn't miss. I have records, extensive records, all now in Claire's possession. You may contest this will. You may drag my name through the courts. But know this, Claire has enough evidence to see half of you in prison and the other half bankrupt from legal fees. She also has my complete confidence and my lawyer's full support. I chose Claire not because she loved me, she didn't. Not because she cared for me, she merely tolerated me. I chose her because she was the only one who never pretended otherwise. She showed up without agenda. She left without payment. She treated me like a difficult old woman instead of a walking ATM. In death, as in life, I reward honesty over flattery, integrity over greed. Claire will decide what to do with my fortune. Given what I've observed of her character, she'll probably do something noble and idiotic with it, but it's hers to waste as she sees fit. To those of you calculating how to manipulate or threaten her into sharing, remember, she has the records, and unlike the rest of you, she has nothing to lose. Welcome to poverty, darlings. Try not to steal from each other on the way out. Agnes Holloway. Devereaux set down the paper and looked around the room. That concludes the reading. You're free to go. But no one moved. They all stared at me. This nobody granddaughter who just inherited everything they'd spent their lives scheming for. I could see the calculations in their eyes. the fury mixing with fear as they realized what Agnes had meant about records. Finally, I spoke. "I know this is a shock," I said quietly, "and I know you all must have questions." "You conniving little bitch," Patricia hissed. "You played the long game, didn't you, pretending to be so humble, so disinterested?" "I didn't know," I said. "I had no idea she was planning this." "Bullshit," David spat. "Nobody visits that miserable old woman monthly without expecting something." "I expected nothing," I said, "which is apparently why I got everything." Robert stood slowly, using his full height to try to intimidate me. "This isn't over. We'll bury you in litigation. We'll—" "Check your bank accounts," I interrupted. He blinked. "What?" "The $50,000 $1,000 bequests. Check your accounts. They should have been deposited this morning." They all pulled out their phones, the threat of leaving forgotten. One by one, their faces changed as they confirmed the deposits. "That money," I continued, "is conditional on not contesting the will. Challenge it, and you have to return every penny. It's all in the fine print." "You can't do that," Sarah protested. "I can't, but Agnes could, and did." I stood, gathering my purse. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back to work. I have a shift to finish." "Work?" Thomas finally spoke, incredulous. "You just inherited millions and you're going back to work." "It's what people do," I said, "when they weren't raised expecting handouts." I moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and about those records Agnes mentioned, I've already placed copies in a safety deposit box with instructions for my lawyer. If anything happens to me, any accidents, any sudden illnesses, any unexpected tragedies, everything goes straight to the FBI and IRS. I smiled, channeling a bit of Agnes herself. "Just so we're all clear on the new rules." I left them there, mouths open, schemes crumbling, the dynasty they'd built on grandmother's money burning down around them. In the elevator down, I finally allowed myself to feel the weight of what had just happened. $4.7 million, properties, accounts, art, more money than I could spend in 5 lifetimes, and 30 years of family fury aimed directly at my head. Agnes had made me rich, but more than that, she'd made me untouchable, armored in their own sins. The real test wasn't over, it was just beginning. The assault began within hours. By the time I got back to my cubicle at Brennan & Associates, my phone had 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and enough venomous voicemails to fuel a harassment lawsuit. I turned it off and tried to focus on the Anderson audit, but my hands were shaking too badly to type. Claire, my supervisor, Janet, appeared at my desk. "There's someone here to see you." My stomach dropped. Had one of them come to my workplace already? But it was Jake waiting in the lobby, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing his worried face, the one he reserved for when I was being too stubborn about accepting help. "Figured you might need reinforcement," he said, handing me a cup. "Also, your apartment building manager called me. Apparently, there's a crowd of family members demanding to be let into your unit." Of course there was. I should go deal with... "No." Jake's voice was firm. "You should file a police report. Then you should come stay with me for a few days. Then you should probably get a really good lawyer who isn't connected to your family." He was right. I knew he was right, but Agnes's voice echoed in my head. "Be both kind and strong." "I need to go to my apartment first," I said. "Get some things, including the documents Agnes left me." "Then I'm coming with you." We took Jake's car, leaving mine in the parking garage. I spent the drive reading through the latest texts. They ran the gamut from pleading Thomas, "Please, Claire, let's talk about this like family," to threatening David, "You have no idea who you're fucking with," to bizarrely conciliatory Patricia. "Perhaps we were hasty. Why don't we discuss this over lunch?" Only Sarah maintained her medical professionalism, sending a single text. Grandmother's mental state had been deteriorating for years. "I have documentation from her physician about early-stage dementia. Think carefully about your next moves." "She's lying," I told Jake. "I've seen Agnes's medical records in the files she left. Her doctor noted she was remarkably sharp for her age, just 6 months ago. So they're already trying to build a case. They're already trying everything. My apartment building was a converted Victorian in a decent neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but safe and well-maintained, or it had been, before the Holloway siege began. Robert's Mercedes was parked illegally in the fire lane. Patricia's Range Rover blocked 2 handicapped spaces. David had actually parallel parked correctly, but he was pacing the sidewalk like a caged predator, phone pressed to his ear. Sarah leaned against her Lexus, still in scrubs, playing the concerned physician to a small crowd of my neighbors. Really worried about my cousin, she was saying. She's been under tremendous stress, and now she's had this shock. What shock? Mrs. Chen from 2B asked. Claire seems fine to me. Inheriting millions of dollars can be very destabilizing, Sarah said with practiced sympathy, especially for someone who's never had money. We just want to make sure she's okay. Jake pulled up to the curb. Through the windshield, I watched my family notice the car. Watched them straighten like hunting dogs catching a scent. Ready? Jake asked. No, but let's do it anyway. We got out together. The afternoon sun caught the highlights in David's perfectly styled hair as he strode toward us. Claire, we need to talk. No, I said, walking past him. We don't. Robert intercepted us at the building entrance. You can't just walk away from this. We're family. Funny how I'm family now, I said. Where was that sentiment at Christmas, at Easter, at any family gathering for the past decade? Don't be dramatic, Patricia interjected, tottering over on heels too high for the cracked sidewalk. We've always included you. You served me dinner on paper plates while everyone else used china, I reminded her. You sat me at the kids' table until I was 23. You forgot to invite me to Sarah's engagement party. Minor oversights. Statements. You were making statements, and I heard them loud and clear. I pulled out my keys, but David grabbed my arm. Jake stepped forward, but I shook my head slightly. I could handle this. Let go, I said quietly. Not until you listen. David, I looked him straight in the eye. I know about the skimming, the estate fees you've been inflating, the fake receipts. I have copies of everything. Now let go, or I call the police. His hand dropped like I'd burned him. You wouldn't, he said, but uncertainty colored his voice. Try me. I unlocked the building door. Jake followed me in, leaving my family on the sidewalk, but I could hear Sarah's voice, sharp with desperation. This isn't over. No, it wasn't. My apartment looked like it had been ransacked, except nothing had been touched. That was the unsettling part, everything exactly where I'd left it, but with the subtle sensation that it had all been observed, catalogued, evaluated. They'd been here, not inside, but close enough to peer through windows, to test doors, to plan. I went straight to my closet and pulled out the gym bag I'd prepared this morning. Clothes, toiletries, laptop, then to the kitchen, where I'd hidden Agnes's documents in a Cheerios box, the last place anyone would look for $4 million worth of secrets. Clever, Jake said, watching me transfer the papers to the bag. Paranoid, I corrected, but apparently justified. My phone, which I'd turned back on, immediately exploded with notifications. I scrolled through them, deleting voicemails without listening. Then one name made me pause. Linda Morrison. I played the message on speaker. Claire, dear, it's Linda. I wanted to thank you for the beautiful eulogy. Mrs. Agnes would have, well, she would have pretended to hate it, but I think she would have been pleased. I also wanted to warn you your Uncle Robert came by the house this morning. He was looking for something in her study. I told him the estate was sealed until probate, but he was very insistent. I've notified Mr. Devereaux, but I thought you should know. Please be careful. Dear, your grandmother always said the family would show their true colors when the money was involved. I'm afraid she was right. We should go, Jake said. Pack whatever else you need. We can come back with movers for the rest. But I was looking around my small apartment, my sanctuary, my proof that I could make it on my own, and feeling something shift inside me. This morning, I'd been Claire Holloway, junior auditor, nobody granddaughter. Now I was Claire Holloway, millionaire heiress, target. They won't stop, I said. You know that, right? They'll dig into my life, my work, my relationships. They'll try to prove I'm mentally unstable, or that I manipulated Agnes, or that I'm incompetent to manage the estate. They'll make my life hell until I give them what they want. So what do you want to do? I thought about Agnes's letter. Be both kind and strong. I want to beat them at their own game, I said. But first, I need to understand the rules. We left through the back entrance, avoiding the family circus out front. As Jake drove us toward his apartment in a better part of town, I pulled out the journal Agnes had left me and started reading more carefully. Each entry was a masterclass in observation. Agnes had documented not just the financial crimes but the personal ones' affairs, addictions, lies told at holiday dinners. She'd known about David's cocaine problem, Sarah's prescription fraud, Patricia's embezzlement from her children's trust funds. She'd known and said nothing, just watched and wrote it all down. But between the damning entries were others, quieter observations. Claire visited again today, brought Chinese food. She thinks I don't notice that she always orders an extra entree, claims she over-ordered, then leaves it for my lunch tomorrow. She thinks she's being subtle. She's not. But it's the only kindness I receive that doesn't come with a bill attached. Watched Claire at Robert's birthday party. They sat her by the kitchen, away from the real family. She spent the evening helping the catering staff clear plates, not for show, not for praise. She just saw they were overwhelmed. Catherine raised her right, despite my best efforts to make her harder. Claire's mother died 5 years ago today. She was the only one who remembered. Brought yellow roses, Katie's favorites. Didn't mention the anniversary. Just left the flowers and sat with me while I pretended not to cry. I should thank her. I won't. You okay? Jake asked, glancing over at my tears. She saw everything, I said. All of it. The good and the bad and the spaces in between. She saw it all and judged us for it. And she chose you. Because I didn't want to be chosen. How fucked up is that? Or because you were the only one who treated her like a person instead of a prize. We pulled into Jake's building's garage. Safe, gated, with security cameras. The opposite of my charming but vulnerable Victorian conversion. As we rode the elevator up to his apartment, I made a decision. My family wanted to play dirty. They wanted to threaten and manipulate and destroy. Fine. But I wouldn't play defense. Agnes hadn't raised me, that was true. But she'd been preparing me for this my whole life, in her twisted way, teaching me to endure cruelty without breaking, to expect nothing and therefore be surprised by nothing, to survive without their approval or affection. Now she'd given me the ultimate test: survive with their hatred. I need to make some calls, I told Jake as we entered his apartment, starting with Richard Devereaux, then a financial advisor, then probably a security company. And then, I thought of my family, circling my apartment like vultures, of the records in my bag that could destroy them, of Agnes, lying in her expensive coffin, probably laughing at all of us. Then I give them exactly what they deserve. The war began in earnest the following week. First came the legal salvos. David filed a formal challenge to the will, claiming undue influence and diminished capacity. Sarah submitted a mountain of medical documentation, some real, most creatively interpreted, suggesting Agnes had been suffering from dementia. Patricia took a different approach, filing a separate suit claiming Agnes had made verbal promises that superseded the written will. Robert, ever the strategist, went for the jugular. He filed for an emergency injunction to freeze all assets pending investigation, arguing that I was a flight risk who might squander the estate before the courts could determine rightful ownership. They're trying to bleed you dry, Devereaux explained during our strategy meeting. His office had become my second home, the leather and mahogany a far cry from my usual world. Death by 1,000 legal cuts. They know they can't win outright, but they hope to make fighting so expensive and exhausting that you'll settle. How expensive? At this rate, you're looking at $200,000 just to get through preliminary hearings. Could go over $1 million if they drag it to trial. I laughed, actually laughed. Agnes left me $4.7 million and they think I'll balk at spending $1 million to keep it. Devereaux smiled. That's what I told them. But they're not thinking clearly. Greed rarely promotes rational thought. He was right about that. The family group text, which I hadn't been removed from, probably so they could intimidate me, had devolved into increasingly unhinged discussions. They'd even started turning on each other. Sarah accused David of grandstanding with his legal challenge. Patricia suggested Sarah's medical claims were fraudulent. Thomas stayed silent but screenshot everything, probably planning to sell the story to a tabloid if things got interesting enough. But the legal attacks were just the beginning. My workplace became a battlefield. David, using his legal connections, had someone call my employer claiming I was under investigation for fraud. HR hauled me in for a mortifying meeting where I had to explain that the fraud was inheriting money from my grandmother. This is obviously a family dispute, Janet, my supervisor, said carefully, but you understand we have to take any allegations seriously. I understand, I said. I also understand that defamation is a crime. My lawyer will be happy to explain that to whoever made the call. The call stopped, but the damage was done. My coworkers looked at me differently now. The woman who'd inherited millions but still showed up to audit accounts. Some with envy, some with suspicion, all with distance. Then came the personal attacks. My credit report suddenly showed inquiries from dozens of companies. My social media accounts were flooded with friend requests from strangers who turned out to be private investigators. Someone I suspected Patricia hired a photographer to follow me, hoping to catch me in something compromising or embarrassing. Let them waste their money, Jake said, cooking dinner while I scrolled through the latest batch of invasive messages. What are they going to photograph? You going to work, buying groceries, getting coffee. But that was exactly what they photographed. And somehow, in their hands, ordinary activities became sinister. A photo of me laughing at lunch with a colleague became heartless heiress celebrates while family suffers. A shot of me at the bank became suspicious financial activities. They leaked these to social media, to gossip sites, trying to paint a picture of me as either a gold digger or a sociopath. The turning point came 3 weeks after the will reading. I was leaving Jake's apartment building when Thomas approached. Of all my relatives, he looked the worst hollow-eyed, unshaven, his usual artistic dishevelment replaced by something more desperate. Claire, wait, please. I paused, hand on my car door. What do you want? Thomas? To talk. Just talk. No lawyers, no recordings, just family. I almost laughed at that word. Family, but something in his expression stopped me. You've got 5 minutes, I said. He glanced around nervously, then spoke in a rush. They're planning something, Robert and David, I don't know what, but I heard them talking about alternative pressure. Sarah's already got a psychiatrist friend ready to testify that you're showing signs of sudden wealth syndrome. They want you declared incompetent to manage the estate. Why are you telling me this? He ran a hand through his messy hair. Because you were right. At the funeral, what you said about grandmother, about her being our North Star. Even when we sailed away from her, I've been thinking about that, about how we all spent so much time hating her that we became her, cold, calculating, obsessed with money. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being the family fuck-up who sold fake paintings to replace the real ones I'd stolen. I'm tired of pretending I'm too artistic to care about money while secretly being desperate for it. I'm just tired. He looked genuinely exhausted. This cousin who'd once been the golden child, the one with talent and charm and grandmother's favor until he disappointed her by choosing art over business. What do you want? Thomas. Out, he said simply. I want out. Take the $50,000 she left me. Forget the lawsuits. Forget the schemes. Just let me walk away clean. You could do that anyway. No, they won't let me. Robert's already talking about pooling resources for the legal fight, contributing my share or being cut off entirely. He laughed bitterly. Cut off from what we're already getting scraps, but they can't see it. They're so focused on what they think they deserve, that they can't see what they've become. I studied him carefully. Of all my cousins, Thomas had always been the most human, flawed, definitely, weak, certainly, but capable of moments of genuine emotion that the others had trained out of themselves. "The forgeries," I said. "Tell me about them." His face flushed. "Started 5 years ago. I was broke, between galleries, and grandmother had all this art just sitting there. Figured she'd never notice if I swapped a few pieces. Sold the originals to private collectors, replaced them with my copies. But she did notice." "Of course she did. She noticed everything, but she never said a word, just kept inviting me over, kept walking me past the forgeries like they were real. I think she enjoyed watching me squirm." That sounded like Agnes. "How many?" 12 pieces. Total value about $400,000. I made a decision that would have horrified my family both for its mercy and its strategy. "Give me the names of the buyers and any documentation you have. Help me recover what can be recovered. In exchange, I won't pursue charges. And you can keep your $50,000 free and clear." His eyes widened. "You'd do that?" "Agnes is gone. Thomas, the games should end with her." He sagged with relief, then caught himself. "The others won't stop. You know that. Right, Robert especially. He's leveraged to the hilt, based on expected inheritance. Without grandmother's money, he's facing bankruptcy." "I know." "And you're still not going to settle. Would you," I asked, "if someone gave you a chance to be free of all this, the expectations, the manipulations, the constant measuring of worth by bank balance, would you give it up just to keep the peace?" He smiled sadly. "No, I guess I wouldn't." He gave me his phone number, his real one, not the family group chat, and promised to send the documentation about the forgeries. As he walked away, I called after him. "Thomas, the alternative pressure you mentioned, any specifics?" He turned back, glancing around again. "Just be careful who you trust. They've been looking into your boyfriend, your friends, anyone they can use as leverage." My blood ran cold. Jake. They were going after Jake. I rushed back to his apartment. Mind racing. How far would they go? How much damage were they willing to do to get what they wanted? The answer was waiting in Jake's living room. Sarah sat on his couch, still in her doctor's coat, looking perfectly professional and deeply concerned. Jake stood by the window, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Claire," Sarah said, rising smoothly, "we need to talk about your mental health." "Get out," I said flatly. "I'm here as a medical professional," she continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Your behavior lately has been concerning. Paranoia, delusions of persecution, sudden personality changes. These are all symptoms of—" "Get out." "I've already explained to Jake," she said, producing a folder. "The stress of sudden wealth, combined with your history of family trauma, it's perfectly understandable that you'd need help managing—" Jake moved then, crossing to the door and opening it wide. "You heard her? Leave." Sarah's composed mask slipped. "You don't understand. She needs help, professional help, before she hurts herself or others with her erratic decisions." "The only erratic decision I see," Jake said calmly, "is you thinking I'd betray Claire because you showed up with a fake diagnosis and crocodile tears. Now get out before I call security." Sarah gathered her folder, her dignified exit somewhat marred by the way her hands shook. At the door, she turned back. "This isn't over, Claire. We're trying to help you." "No," I said. "You're trying to rob me. There's a difference." After she left, Jake locked the door and pulled me into a hug. "They actually thought I'd turn on you for money." "They would," I said into his shoulder. "Every single one of them would sell out anyone for the right price." "Then they don't know the first thing about real value." That night, I made a decision. No more defense, no more reacting to their attacks. It was time to show the Holloway family exactly what their matriarch had seen in me. I opened Agnes's journal to a page I'd marked earlier. The way to ruin someone isn't by striking at their strengths, but by letting their flaws eat away at them. Give them enough room, and they'll precipitate their own downfall while you look on. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked, seeing my expression. I'm thinking it's time to give them some rope. The student was ready. The lessons Agnes had taught through cruelty and observation were about to be put to use. My family wanted war. They were about to learn why Agnes Holloway had chosen her least likely heir. The beauty of being an auditor is that you learn to see patterns, numbers tell stories, and financial records reveal truth better than any confession. Agnes had left me more than money. She'd left me a roadmap to destroying the people who would destroy me. I started with David. His legal filings had been aggressive, comprehensive, and expensive. Too expensive for a lawyer who supposedly ran a successful practice. A little digging through Agnes's records revealed the truth. David's firm was hemorrhaging money, bad investments, worse spending habits, and a cocaine addiction that consumed both his income and his judgment. But the real gift was in Agnes's journal, dated 6 months ago. David came begging again today. His dealer is threatening him, $50,000 this time. I gave him $10,000 and told him it was the last. He actually laughed, said he'd just take the rest when I died. I recorded the conversation. He really should check for cameras in my study. The recording was in the safety deposit box, along with dozens of others. I made copies and sent them to Devereaux. "What do you want to do with these?" he asked after listening to a particularly damning conversation where David discussed falsifying client billing to fund his habit. "Nothing yet," I said. "Just hold them. Let David keep filing his motions and running up bills he can't afford. You're waiting for him to implode on his own." "I'm giving him rope," I said, remembering Agnes's words. Patricia was easier. Her current husband, number 3, didn't know about the prenup she'd violated by hiding assets she'd stolen from her children's trust funds. One anonymous tip to his lawyer, and suddenly Patricia was too busy fighting her own legal battles to worry about mine. But Robert was the real prize. As executor of Agnes's estate before the will change, he'd had access to everything, and he'd used it. The forensic accountant I hired, recommended by Devereaux, paid for by the estate, found years of systematic theft disguised as investment management. "He's been using your grandmother's accounts as his personal trading fund," the accountant explained. "Making high-risk investments, keeping the profits, charging the losses to the estate. Classic embezzlement, but sophisticated enough that without these records, it would be nearly impossible to prove." "How much?" "Over the past 5 years, approximately $1.2 million in stolen profits, plus another $800,000 in losses he illegally charged to the estate. $2 million. Robert had stolen $2 million from his own mother while smiling at Sunday dinners. I sat on this information for 2 weeks, watching as Robert grew increasingly desperate. His injunction to freeze the assets had been denied. His business was struggling without the cushion of embezzled funds. He started making mistakes, getting sloppy. That's when I received an unexpected ally. Linda called me one evening, her voice trembling with excitement. "Claire, dear, I found something. I was cleaning out Mrs. Agnes's room. The lawyer said I could pack her personal items, and there was a hidden compartment in her jewelry box." "What kind of compartment?" "USB drives, 3 of them, labeled insurance." My heart raced. "Linda, don't touch anything else. I'll be right there." I drove to Agnes's house, my house now. Though I hadn't been able to bring myself to visit with Jake beside me, the place looked exactly as it always had, imposing, immaculate, cold. Linda met us at the door, practically vibrating with nervous energy. The USB drives were tiny things, easy to overlook, but their contents were devastating. Security footage, hours and hours of it, covering years of family gatherings. Agnes had been recording everything, not just in her study, but throughout the house. Every cruel comment, every scheme discussed over coffee, every confession made in supposed privacy, including a conversation from last Christmas between Robert and David, where they discussed having Agnes declared incompetent and taking control of her assets. "We need to move fast," Robert's voice said clearly. "Her mind's still sharp, but if we get Sarah to document some episodes, create a pattern." "I can handle the legal side," David replied. "But we need incidents, Maybe if we switch her medications just enough to cause some confusion. I had to pause the video, even knowing how low they'd sink. This shocked me. They were planning to hurt her, Jake said quietly. Their own mother. But they didn't get the chance, Linda said firmly. I managed all Mrs. Agnes's medications. Any switching would have gone through me, and I would never. I know, I assured her. You protected her, even from her own family. We spent hours reviewing the footage, finding evidence of every family member's worst moments. Sarah stealing prescription pads from Agnes's doctor, Patricia pocketing jewelry during a visit, Thomas actually completing one of his forgeries in Agnes's own art studio, thinking he was alone. And through it all, Agnes, watching from her chair, pretending to doze but missing nothing, occasionally making notes in her journal, building her case against her own blood with the patience of a spider. The next morning, I had Devereaux call a meeting, not at his office at Agnes's house, my house. Let them come to me for once. They arrived separately, but within minutes of each other, probably coordinating in the parking lot. I waited in Agnes's study, the throne room, where she'd held court for decades. I wore my best suit and my grandmother's pearl necklace, the only piece of jewelry I'd claimed so far. Thank you all for coming, I said as they filed in. The power dynamic had shifted. They were in my space now, surrounded by the portraits of ancestors who'd probably be appalled by their descendants' behavior. Cut the act, Robert snapped. What do you want? To end this, I gestured to the conference table where Devereaux had arranged several folders. Each of you has a folder. Inside, you'll find documentation of your various activities. David, yours includes recordings of drug deals and discussions of client fraud. Patricia, yours covers the trust fund theft and your prenup violations. Sarah, prescription fraud and insurance scams. Robert. I paused, meeting his eyes. Yours is special. $2 million in embezzlement, documented and verified, plus conspiracy to commit elder abuse. They opened the folders slowly, faces draining of color as they realized the scope of what Agnes had collected. This is blackmail, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, I corrected. Blackmail would be if I asked for something in return for silence. I'm not asking for anything. I'm telling you what's going to happen. I stood, channeling every boardroom meeting I'd ever witnessed, every moment of Agnes's iron control. You will drop all legal challenges to the will. You will cease all harassment of me, of Jake, of my colleagues. You will take your $50,000 and disappear from my life. In exchange, I won't forward these files to the appropriate authorities. You wouldn't, Sarah breathed. I'm an auditor, I reminded her. I'm legally obligated to report financial crimes. The only reason I haven't already is because Agnes asked me to give you one chance. This is it. And if we refuse? Robert asked, though he already knew the answer. Then I stop protecting you from the consequences of your own actions. The IRS will be very interested in your tax evasion. The State Medical Board will want to discuss Sarah's prescription habits. The Bar Association will have questions for David. And Patricia's soon-to-be ex-husband will have excellent ammunition for his divorce proceedings. Silence filled the room. I could practically hear them calculating, weighing their greed against their fear. Thomas hadn't been invited to this meeting. He'd already sent me the information about the forgeries and was in the process of negotiating their return. His $50,000 would go toward making amends. He was choosing redemption. The only one who could. You poisoned her against us, Patricia said finally, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of grief, they were tears of rage. No, I said simply. You did that yourselves. Every stolen dollar, every cruel word, every scheme and betrayal. Agnes saw it all, recorded it all, remembered it all. I just inherited the evidence. One by one, they signed the documents Devereaux had prepared, legal agreements dropping all claims to the estate. In exchange, I signed my own documents agreements not to pursue criminal or civil action based on the evidence Agnes had collected. Unless, I added as they prepared to leave, you violate this agreement, then all bets are off. They left without another word, broken and bitter, but thoroughly defeated. I stood in the window watching their expensive cars pull away, knowing I'd probably never see them again. The family that had never wanted me had been exiled by their own greed.
"Well done," Devereaux said quietly. "Your grandmother would be proud."
Would she? I sank into Agnes's chair, my chair now. I just destroyed her family. No, Linda said from the doorway where she'd been listening. They destroyed themselves. You just showed them the mirror. That night, alone in my inherited mansion, I found one last letter from Agnes. It had been in the jewelry box with the USB drives, marked Open After Victory.
Claire.
If you're reading this, then you've done what I knew you could. You've survived them. More than that, you've conquered them. I know you think me cruel for putting you through this, but cruelty with purpose is sometimes kindness. I've given you what I could never give your mother: freedom from their expectations, their manipulations, their bottomless need. The money is yours. Do with it what you will. But remember, wealth is just a tool. It's character that determines how that tool is used. You passed my tests not by being cruel, but by being clever, not by being heartless, but by being just. You gave them every chance to be better, and when they chose worse, you gave them consequences. Be better than all of us, Claire, but never be weaker. Your grandmother, Agnes. P.S. The house is too big for one person. Sell it. Buy something that makes you happy. And for God's sake, stop shopping in the clearance section. You're rich now. Act like it. I laughed through my tears, hearing her voice in every word. Agnes Holloway cruel, calculating, and ultimately, in her own twisted way, loving. The war was over. I'd won. Now I had to figure out what victory meant. 6 months later, I stood in the empty foyer of Agnes Holloway's mansion, watching sunlight stream through windows I'd never seen opened while she was alive. The estate sale had gone well, furniture to collectors, art to museums, the house itself to a young tech couple who promised to fill it with children's laughter. You sure about this? Jake asked, carrying the last box to the door. The house needs a family, I said, a real one. I'd kept only a few things: Agnes's journal, her pearl necklace, and oddly enough, the ugly ceramic cat she'd always kept on her mantel. It was hideous, but it made me smile. Even tyrants have their quirks. The $50,000 I'd given each family member had dispersed them effectively. David entered rehab finally and sent a single email saying he was moving to Colorado after treatment. Sarah relocated to Seattle, taking a position at a hospital that didn't know her history. Patricia's divorce had been messy but final. Last I heard, she was living modestly in Florida, working at her daughter's boutique. Robert had been the hardest hit. The IRS, tipped off by anonymous sources, not me. Actually turned out Agnes had filed reports before she died, found enough to audit him going back 7 years. He'd avoided prison but lost his practice, his reputation, and most of his assets. He moved to Canada, where his wife had family. Only Thomas remained in contact. He'd returned 8 of the 12 forgeries, the others lost to private collections. With his $50,000 and money from selling his own paintings, legitimate ones, he'd opened a small gallery featuring unknown artists. We had coffee sometimes, carefully rebuilding something that might eventually resemble family. The lawyers are here, Linda announced. She'd stayed on to help with the transition, though I'd made sure her $100,000 was safely invested for her retirement. The final papers were simple: signing over the house, transferring the last accounts, officially closing the estate of Agnes Holloway, $4.7 million, minus taxes, lawyers, and the family payouts, left me with just over $3 million. I'd quit my job at Brennan & Associates not immediately, but after training my replacement and finishing my pending audits, my supervisor Janet had been surprisingly understanding. "You could have just walked out," she'd said. "Most people who inherit millions do." "I'm not most people," I'd replied, and I wasn't. Agnes had made sure of that. The money hadn't changed me, but it had freed me. I'd started my own forensic accounting firm, specializing in estate fraud. It seemed fitting. Jake and I had bought a reasonable house in a good neighborhood, with a garden I was slowly learning to tend. We'd even gotten a dog, a rescue mutt who enjoyed sleeping in sunbeams and had probably never heard a harsh word in his life. I'd also started a foundation, the Catherine Holloway Foundation, named for my mother. It provided support for young people who'd lost parents, helping with everything from funeral costs to college tuition. It felt like something she would have done if she'd had the chance. "Ready?" Devereaux asked after the papers were signed. I took one last look around the mansion. Somewhere in these walls, Agnes had spent decades watching, recording, judging. She'd built an empire and a family, then watched both corrupt themselves with greed. She'd been cruel and calculating and utterly alone. But she'd also seen something in me worth saving, worth testing, worth trusting with everything she'd built. "Thank you," I said to the empty foyer, "for all of it." Then I walked out, leaving the ghosts to their new owners. That evening, we held a different kind of gathering at my new house. Linda came, and Thomas, and Jake's family, warm, loud people who hugged without calculation. Even Devereaux stopped by, bringing wine and stories about Agnes I'd never heard. Moments when her mask had slipped and revealed the woman underneath. "She talked about you constantly," he told me. "Even when she was calling you that mouse of Catherine's, there was something in her voice, pride, maybe, or hope." "She was testing me my whole life," I said. "Or protecting you," Linda suggested, "keeping you away from the family poison, making sure you grew up clean." I thought about that as the evening wound down, about Agnes's cruel kindness, her strategic mercy. She'd made me strong by withholding affection, made me independent by denying support. She'd saved me by seeming to reject me. It wasn't love as most people understood it, but it was love as Agnes Holloway could give it, calculated, purposeful, ultimately effective. The doorbell rang as I was cleaning up. I opened it to find a delivery man with a single envelope. Claire Holloway. This was to be delivered exactly 6 months after the completion of probate. Inside was a card in Agnes's handwriting. "Stop mourning me and live your life. You have the money. You have the freedom. You have Jake, who is worth more than all the Holloway fortune combined. Be nice. Be happy. Claire, it's the one thing I never figured out how to do. Also, that ceramic cat is hideous. I can't believe you kept it. Agnes." I ran to the mantel where I'd placed the ugly ceramic cat. Turning it over, I found a small compartment in the base. Inside was a flash drive and a photo of my mother and Agnes at my mother's wedding, both smiling, arms around each other. The flash drive contained one file of video dated a week before Agnes died. She sat in her study, looking frailer than I'd ever seen her, but with eyes still sharp as razors. "Hello, Claire," she said to the camera. "If you're watching this, then you've survived the test. Good. I knew you would. I want you to know something. That eulogy you gave about the grandmother who made hot chocolate and gave shelter, that's who I wish I'd been. That's who I should have been. But I was too afraid of being weak, too damaged by my own upbringing to show kindness without price. Your mother understood that. She forgave me for it, even when I couldn't forgive myself. She'd be so proud of who you've become, strong enough to show mercy, wise enough to know when not to. The family will blame you for their downfall. Let them. They did it to themselves with their greed and cruelty. You just held up the mirror. But you, Claire, you looked at an old woman everyone hated and found something worth eulogizing. You created beauty from bitterness. That's a gift I never had. Be better than all of us. I think you already are. Now stop crying and go live your life. That's an order from your grandmother." The video ended. I sat on my couch in my modest house with my rescue dog and my kind boyfriend and my small circle of chosen family, and I cried for Agnes Holloway one last time. Not for the grandmother she'd been, but for the one she'd helped me imagine, the one who existed somewhere between truth and fiction, cruelty and kindness, the woman who taught me that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money at all. It's the freedom to choose who you want to be. The ceramic cat went back on the mantel, ugly as ever. A reminder that even the hardest people can surprise you, that love doesn't always look like greeting cards and hugs. Sometimes it looks like tests failed and passed, like cruelty with purpose, like an old woman playing a long game to save the one grandchild who never asked to be saved. My name is Claire Holloway. I inherited a fortune from a grandmother who never said she loved me, but in her own twisted way, she gave me something more valuable than money. She gave me the chance to prove that kindness and strength aren't opposites, they're partners. And in the end, that's the only eulogy that matters. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below, so we can connect and discuss what you thought about Agnes and Claire's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. And if you really want to help others discover this tale, please hit the hype button to boost this video. Your support means everything and helps these stories reach more people who might need to hear them. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what we receive, but who we choose to become.